Hi, everyone. I'm Gordon Haffga, Technology Evangelist with Red Hat, and I'm pleased to be joined by Irshad today to talk about data and data services. Irshad, please introduce yourself.
Hey, Gordon. Hey, everyone. My name is Irshad Raihan이. I am Director of Product Marketing at Red Hat's Cloud Storage and Data Services business.
So, Irshad, to start with, I'd like to ask you something that I think will help frame the rest of this discussion. First, I'm going out on a limb and make the assumption that data-related challenges organizations are facing today are different from in the past. Is my assumption right? And if so, what has changed?
It's an interesting question, Gordon. The assumption is mostly right. What is interesting is that the fundamentals really haven't changed that much. They're manifesting themselves differently in today's world. So think about the classic 3 V's, right? We've talked about volume, variety, and velocity of data. We've been talking about this, since the time of Hadoop. However, the way that they're manifesting themselves are in the context of much greater collaboration. So even though the volume of data has been steadily increasing, and maybe not steadily in some cases, exponentially in other cases, it's really more about how do you get different stakeholders across the data pipeline to collaborate around the data. That's really the challenge. You think about velocity, it's the same thing. It's about portability of data. At the same time, it's access and security of the same data. If you think about variety, in the past, we talked about unstructured versus structured data. But when you really think about unstructured, the number of devices out there far outnumber the number of sources of structured data. So think about Internet of Things and Edge and other things that are driving that variety of data. What it really boils down to, Gordon, in my view, is the mindset of the average enterprise has changed. Most enterprises realize that they can't compete now in the way that they utilize data. And that is causing fundamental seismic shifts in the way that data companies really operate.
At this point, it's probably also worth discussing why we're talking about data and data services, whereas in the past, I think we'd have been talking storage.
I think that's a valid point. In fact, as I introduced myself, right, we really sort of serve both sides of the coin, right? Cloud storage and data services. In a sense, storage is a means to an end, Gordon, right? The value of data is very much tied to applications and to the business. In fact, you've covered this in other segments of this series as well, about some of those lines blurring between infrastructure and applications. And so this is really part of that broader movement where infrastructure operators cannot operate in a silo. They have to be much more business savvy. It's very much, purpose-built infrastructure for the workload and the business problem you're trying to solve. And therefore, data services really serves as that glue that sits between the infrastructure and the business to really go back to, addressing those pain points around volume, variety, and velocity. So it's a trend that we're seeing a lot more of in our industry.
I'm interested from your perspective, what are the important elements of data services?
Yeah, there's multiple ways to slice things up, Gordon. One of the simplest ways we find that customers tend to think of is in terms of data at rest, data in motion, and data in action. And the reason we think of it that way is it's you can very easily get overwhelmed by the challenges around all of the, just managing the data in an organization. The easiest way that we find customers think through this is, I've got a lot of data that is, traditional data that I've been collecting through, traditional BI systems, through point of sale systems, things like that, structured data effectively. But there's a lot more of unstructured, NoSQL type of data that lives within organizations as well. So I need a strategy around that data at rest. But at the same time, I'm also dealing with data in motion. So think about all of the streaming ingest that's coming into an organization. We talked about edge and devices and things like that. And how do I marry some of that data? How do I quickly gain insights? Because what's interesting about the sort of contrast between data at rest and data in motion is data at rest is, every bit of the data is valuable, right? Data in motion, however, think about an RFID sensor, think about a power meter. Most of the data that it's sending into the gateway is actually not that interesting. What's interesting is when there's spikes and troughs in the data, right? So there's almost a different mindset you would need to handle data in motion versus data at rest. But the third pillar is where we think is the most exciting, right? That's the data in action. That's the glue. That's the piece where we talk about things like collaboration. We talk about real-time insights, AI, ML, and all of that happening. So if I think most customers, as they sort of break things down, this is probably the easiest way to marry the old and the new, as well as a lot of things that are happening around the edge.
So Irshad, we've sort of been talking in the abstract. To make this a bit more tangible for our audience, could you take us through how data services might play into, say, a machine learning AI workload, maybe even one that's distributed in some manner?
Absolutely, Gordon. So this is a classic data in action scenario, right? One of the examples that is very prominently out there is the Open Data Hub project that is a community project, and it really attacks the heart of the problem around collaboration. Data scientists and data engineers have been telling us for years that the easy bits are sometimes actually working on the inferencing and the model training. The hard bits are the collaboration, right? Take COVID as an example. One of the reasons we were able to roll out the vaccine just across the world is the research that went into the collaboration, being able to quickly share those insights between the medical and the research industries and be able to take that to production. We're seeing that happen in a number of different scenarios. So for instance, the Mass Open Cloud is another platform where we've been able to work with a number of hospital networks to be able to really share those insights across departments. There's a lot of literature out there, but I'll point you to an interesting demo where we looked at how AI/ML can actively scour, hundreds of thousands of X-rays and be able to pinpoint possible risks for respiratory infections much faster and at a much greater scale than any human could. So those are examples of how we can certainly address some of that scale, but also the real-time insight sharing, right? How many times have we dealt with, not just in the healthcare industry, but across retail, financial services, where being able to offer real-time insights is infinitely valuable in making those real-time decisions, whether it's pricing around commodities, whether it's making decisions around logistics for manufacturing, whether it's healthcare decisions as well. And finally, it's also playing itself out in terms of how this infrastructure is consumed. What we're finding out, Gordon, is there's more and more of an affinity for a managed service model to consume these insights without actually getting bogged down into the infrastructure logistics itself. So what we find is that most healthcare providers tell us that, look, we want to be able to manage the data, and that's really where we excel in being able to take those insights in. Can you help us consume that infrastructure in a way that is much more, pay as you go, and in a way that is aligned to our OpEx model? And so the managed services model lends itself really well to that. When you combine that with projects like the Open Data Hub, you really have a powerful solution that is applicable, really, frankly, across any industry.
So this also seems like a really good example of the intersection of apps, the intersection of services with data that you mentioned earlier.
Yes, absolutely. So this is, again, a broader trend that we're seeing in terms of infrastructure and really the IT teams becoming much more business savvy and much more aware of the workload rather than providing a general purpose platform. Another trend that we've seen is, there's an interesting way of putting it, which is as things have gotten bigger, things have gotten smaller. And what I mean by that is, think about as applications have gotten more complex, they're really being delivered by microservices rather than these monolithic applications, right? Similarly, in infrastructure, what we're finding is that enterprises need much more granular control in the way that not only they purchase, but the way they consume these infrastructure services. And that's going back to that managed services idea, where the cloud has really impacted the way that enterprises consume infrastructure. We're also seeing this manifest itself on the skills side, right? Because of the fact that enterprises need much more granular control without really becoming experts in infrastructure. We've seen the sort of rise of the generalist, right? Where the generalist needs a sense of how to be able to manage that infrastructure for instance, storage and data services, but without becoming an expert in storage or data services. So it behooves all of the vendors to be able to provide these control planes that makes it easier for the generalist to get it just right, where they're able to have the granular control to be able to control things like microservices and work with infrastructure in much smaller buckets than they would have in the past, but also not get too bogged down into those infrastructure logistics.
Close this out, what are the roles in an organization that are likely to make use of these data services?
That's a fantastic question. And in fact, it's a two-part answer, right? There's two facets of data services. If they think about it, northbound, we have the app dev teams, we have DevOps managers, folks that are building applications and that are rolling on an agile basis, rolling these applications out. So there's absolutely no room for downtime or loss of data. Then you've got the chief data officers, right? So folks that are constantly thinking about risk and compliance and business continuity. And in some sense, even developers have started to care about infrastructure, right? This goes back to your point about the lines blurring, right? In the past, developers worked in a silo and infrastructure folks worked in a silo. That's not the case anymore. Developers are much more aware of some of the infrastructure decisions that will drive really innovation for their applications. At the same time, infrastructure admins are much more aware of how the infrastructure is being used. So that's the northbound. On the southbound, how that sort of risk and innovation manifests itself is in terms of resilience and portability. So think about your infrastructure architects, your cloud architects, even your storage admins, right? They're the ones that are really enabling all of this infrastructure to be available, but also to be available in a cloud native context, right? So containers, how does that impact how infrastructure is delivered, right? How does the cloud impact how infrastructure is managed and also build? So there's really two facets of data services. And what's interesting is there's very few companies out there that are able to offer something for both sides of the coin, right? Mostly companies either operate in the app space or the infrastructure space. So as we work with customers and as being a trusted advisor, our advice really would be to work with vendors that can kind of marry those two worlds and consolidate a single control plane for all of data services.
Well, thank you, Irshad.
Thanks, Gordon.